Mark Davis had become used to the rhythm of invisibility. Each evening, when the city skyscrapers lit up against the night, he slipped quietly into the tall office tower with his mop, bucket, and weary determination, blending into the background like part of the furniture. A single father to his 10-year-old daughter, Lily, Mark worked nights as a janitor so he could spend his mornings getting her ready for school and his afternoons making sure she was never left alone. The long hours left him exhausted, but he had grown accustomed to being overlooked. Employees passed him by without a word, executives brushed past as if he were air, and even when he stood in the middle of a hallway, most people avoided eye contact. But being invisible gave him something rare, the ability to observe without being noticed. He saw interns trembling under pressure, assistants wiping away tears in the bathroom stalls, and managers putting on masks of confidence when their hands shook from stress. Perhaps it was his own grief, the years he spent watching his late wife's health fade, that sharpened his instincts for noticing what others ignored. One night, as he moved quietly across the top floor, his mop gliding over the polished tiles, his eyes caught the glow of the CEO's office. Ethan Cole, the man everyone revered as a brilliant and unshakable billionaire, was still there long after everyone had gone home. Most saw Ethan as a symbol of power, success, and cold perfection, but from where Mark stood, he saw something entirely different. The man's shoulders sagged under invisible weight, his skin looked pale beneath the fluorescent light, and his hand moved again and again to his chest as though fighting off a pain he refused to admit. His movements were sluggish, his focus broken, and there was a loneliness in his eyes that echoed the same isolation Mark sometimes felt when he tucked Lily into bed at night and faced the silence of an empty home. The building staff admired Ethan from afar, speaking of him with awe, but none of them looked closely enough to notice the weakness creeping into his frame. No one asked why he stayed so late or why his breath seemed shallower with each passing hour. No one, that is, except Mark, the invisible janitor who couldn't stop seeing what others ignored. Over the next several nights, Mark's unease grew stronger as he noticed more signs that something was dangerously wrong with Ethan Cole, though no one else seemed to care enough to look. Each evening, as Mark pushed his cleaning cart along the executive floor, he observed Ethan through the glass walls of the office, always seated behind his sleek desk, his tie loosened and his complexion pale. His hands trembled when he lifted his coffee cup, and more than once, Mark saw him cough sharply into a tissue before quickly hiding it in the trash, as if ashamed of his own weakness. His assistants, the board members, and even the investors praised Ethan for his relentless work ethic and unbreakable discipline, marveling at how he never seemed to rest, but to Mark, the truth was written all over the man's face, his body was betraying him while his pride forced him to push forward. Mark remembered all too vividly how his late wife had hidden her own symptoms, insisting she was fine until one night her heart had given out in his arms, leaving him a widower with a child to raise. That memory made the sight of Ethan's shaking hands and shallow breathing unbearable, because he recognized the pattern with painful clarity. He debated endlessly with himself, arguing over whether he had the right to speak up. What was a janitor, a man who scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans, compared to a billionaire CEO who commanded empires? What if Ethan laughed in his face, or worse, had him fired for overstepping? And yet, every time Mark saw Ethan massaging his chest with a faint grimace or lingering in his chair as if too weak to stand, the voice of his daughter Lily echoed in his head, her innocent words reminding him, "Daddy, you always say we should help people, even if they don't ask." That childlike truth struck harder than any fear of losing his job. Still, Mark remained torn between duty and doubt, torn between protecting his livelihood and following his conscience. He knew that saying nothing might mean watching Ethan collapse one day, just as he had seen with his wife, and that thought haunted him during his long, lonely bus rides home. As the night stretched on, Mark's mop continued to glide across polished floors, but his eyes stayed locked on the man who seemed untouchable to the world yet was crumbling in silence, waiting for someone, anyone, to notice before it was too late. The storm rolled in on a Thursday night, the kind of heavy rain that hammered against the skyscraper's glass windows and drowned the city in restless noise, and Mark, as always, was alone on the executive floor with nothing but his mop and cart for company, though his eyes kept flicking toward the CEO's office where Ethan Cole still worked long past midnight. Something about the man's posture unsettled him more than usual. Ethan seemed even weaker, slouched deeply in his chair with dark circles under his eyes, his breathing shallow as he rubbed his chest with increasing frequency. Mark tried to focus on his duties, but an uneasy knot twisted in his gut, the same instinct that had once warned him about his wife's final night. And then it happened. Just as Mark turned his cart down the hallway, he heard the sharp crash of glass shattering, followed by the unmistakable thud of a body hitting the floor. He dropped everything and sprinted into the office, his heart pounding as he found Ethan collapsed beside his desk, papers scattered like fallen leaves, his face ashen and his lips tinged with a frightening blue. Without thinking, Mark dropped to his knees and shouted for him to hold on, dialing 911 with shaky fingers while his other hand checked for a pulse. Memories of his wife's final moments surged painfully, but he forced himself to stay focused, pressing Ethan's chest in firm, steady compressions just as he had been taught years ago in the support classes for caregivers. The office filled with the storm's roar and the desperate rhythm of Mark's hands fighting to keep a powerful man alive. Minutes felt like hours until the paramedics finally stormed in, their voices sharp and commanding as they took over, one of them glancing at Mark with quick recognition and saying, "You saved him. If you hadn't started CPR, he wouldn't have made it." Mark sat back on the polished floor, drenched in sweat, his hands trembling as the weight of what had just happened sank in. As they carried Ethan away on a stretcher, the once untouchable CEO now fragile and vulnerable, Mark realized that all his instincts had been right. He had been the only one watching closely enough to see the signs, and tonight, it had made the difference between life and death. When Mark was called to the hospital a few days later, he walked in nervously, unsure why a man as powerful as Ethan Cole would want to see a janitor who scrubbed his floors, but as he stepped into the private suite, his eyes widened at the sight of Ethan sitting upright in the bed, looking pale but alive, his sharp business suit replaced with a hospital gown that made him seem more human than the untouchable figure everyone revered. For a moment, silence filled the room until Ethan's tired eyes met Mark's, and his voice, softer than anyone in the company had likely ever heard, broke the stillness with the words, "You saved me." Mark shifted awkwardly, unsure how to respond, and muttered that he had only done what anyone else would, but Ethan shook his head firmly, insisting that nobody else had seen what was happening, nobody else had cared enough to notice the symptoms he had hidden, and that without Mark's courage, he would not be alive. Mark explained quietly that he had recognized the signs from his late wife's illness and could not bear to stay silent, even though he feared losing his job for overstepping. Ethan listened with an intensity that surprised Mark, his expression filled not with the cold detachment he was known for but with something like respect, even gratitude. "All my life I've been surrounded by people who see me as a title, a bank account, or a symbol," Ethan admitted, his voice breaking slightly, "but you saw me as a man, and you gave me a chance I didn't even realize I needed." He paused, then added, "From now on, I refuse to let you remain invisible." In the weeks that followed, Ethan arranged for Mark to be promoted out of janitorial work and into a stable role within the company that offered enough pay and security for him to build a better future for Lily, but more than the financial blessing, it was the friendship that grew between them that truly mattered. For the first time, Ethan began to open up to someone without fear of judgment, and for Mark, who had been overlooked for years, it felt like being truly seen. Together, the lonely CEO and the single dad discovered that life's greatest successes weren't measured by empires or wealth, but by the simple act of noticing, caring, and saving one another when it mattered most.